these aren't the worst period dramas because they're terrible. I enjoyed a lot of these. They're the worst of 2025 because they could have been so much better. Welcome back to Regency Rumors. This is a companion video to my best period dramas of 2025, and honestly, this one was harder to make. Most of these shows in this video aren't failures. They are well acted, they're beautifully produced, and in a lot of cases, they're really enjoyable. And I love a bit of froth. What puts them in the worst category of the year is that when you compare them to the strongest period dramas of 2026, they fall short in ways that really matter to do with storytelling. For a lot of these shows, it's not about the budget or the talent, it is about the storytelling choices. Some of the thematic shallowness or a reluctancy to really commit to what the story could have been. And that's often more frustrating than something being outright bad. Sometimes I'm not mad at period dramas being cheesy or historically inaccurate. I'm annoyed it took itself too seriously and didn't commit to just being a bit of fun. I'm Kayla, I'm a historian and researcher, and on this channel I talk about period dramas, history, and historical fiction, sometimes analytically, sometimes gossipily, but always historically yapping. So if you loved one of these shows in this video, don't panic. This isn't some big takedown. Think of it more of a conversation about missed opportunities and what these period dramas could do to make these shows better going forward. When I talk about why these shows didn't work for me, I'm not judging them on historical accuracy in a strict checklist sense. I'm using a framework that I call historical connection, something I made up, whether a period drama helps us emotionally understand and connect with the past through its characters, themes, and storytelling. We can't achieve historical authenticity because we cannot fully recreate the past. So it's much more about how shows can build that historical connection to us as an audience emotionally, to where we see people of the past not as stuffy historical figures, but as people like us. I explain that much more fully in my Best Period Dramas of 2025 video that's coming out soon, so I won't repeat it here, but it is the lens that I'm using throughout this discussion. All right, so let's get into it. The Buccaneers Season 2. I really tried to give The Buccaneers a good, hearty try. When Apple TV announced it was going to adapt Edith Wharton's unfinished novel following American heiresses navigating British aristocratic society, I was really excited. Apple TV has produced some solid period dramas in the last 5-6 years, such as the Essex Serpent, which I included in my spooky period drama recommendation video, and Manhunt, which I thought was one of the best period dramas of 2024. What I like about Apple TV is that they are willing to risk giving new shows a fighting chance to become popular without throwing them the axe immediately like Netflix and Amazon Prime are so prone to do. Some of the best niche cult favorite shows of recent years have come from Apple TV, so I was genuinely excited by the possibility that the Buccaneers might deliver something more thoughtful and resonant and historically rich. I was thinking it was going to be like a coming-of-age story rooted in the power of female friendship and emotional growth and challenges between, classes. I really thought this new adaptation of the story would show why it was ready for a new modern reimagining. Instead, and this is just my opinion, the series that was delivered was kind of a CW Rain, Vampire Diaries, frothy teen show, complete reinterpretation of the Buccaneers. And let me be clear in saying I love froth. I love cheesiness. I love teenage shows. That is not me saying those types of shows are lesser than, or the people that watch them are bad or illiterate, or that they need to read more, or whatever it is that people talk about, cheesy teenage shows that are a lot of times aimed at teenage girls. And people want to put down that type of media, and that is not me doing this because I am amongst the people that watch those kind of shows. I just never expected the Buccaneers, on Apple TV of all places, to decide to go in that direction with a classic author's work. And I think this show, it could have been so much more. The biggest hook for the first season is that the girls are specifically American. And Apple TV leans into that like it is the main character of the show. It's even in the theme song. The whole premise is literally a group of fun-loving and free-spirited young women barging into a tightly corseted London society, creating this kind of Anglo-American culture clash that the marketing even pushes front and center in almost every description of the series. That dynamic to me ends up feeling simplistic, and oftentimes it can also feel a bit cringe on screen. It came across as if being American automatically means being quirky and uncaged and spontaneous and fun, and being British automatically means being stuffy and rigid and joyless. People on Reddit noticed this as well. Someone pointed out that the American girls, in their opinion, came off as overwhelmingly annoying and ridiculous, and that how they were kind of portrayed as like a we're different, we're special, almost high school clique, rather than real nuanced characters living in the Gilded Age. And as an American who's lived in the UK for over 13 years, I can see why that stereotype feels a bit stretched. There's literally no shortage of British characters in period dramas who are exciting and unconventional or rule breaking. But in the Buccaneers, the narrative often sidelines them into being obstacles rather than fully realized people. It felt like it kind of created this dynamic of like an us and them type thing where the Americans are fun and alive and the Brits are dysfunctional and toxic and they're just trying to stifle their fun. To me, that could have been a really interesting starting point for a richer exploration of women's immobility in the Gilded Age. You know, the things that really held them back on both sides of the pond. But instead, it really felt like it flattened into what felt like a social media trope between a lot of these female characters. I don't know, something about this made me feel like back when TikTok was down for a day, and half of us in Europe were like, this is kind of refreshing for it not to be all about Americans. And the other half were like, this is only fun and exciting when the Americans are here, so what are we gonna do without them? Not every moment of season 1 was bad by any means. There were some genuinely like deep emotional beats, and the ensemble cast I thought was great. You can see that the actors are really trying to bring a level of vulnerability and connection to the scenes, even when some of the dialogue feels a bit stunted or cheesy. The cliffhanger did make me genuinely excited to see what could come next, which does not happen these days for a lot of brand new shows. They added new cast members such as Leighton Meester, and I thought her character and storyline brought some depth to the series. The romances especially felt like they were on fast forward to me. Relationships that should have taken time to build and have some breathing room. There wasn't a lot of space for like emotional tension, which is kind of what people really love in period romances. That speed came at a real cost to the characters, I think. It almost felt like what was happening is what's happening with Netflix, where storylines are fast tracked to keep people hooked and trying to compete with phone scrolling. So they're kind of like throwing out all the stops so that people don't turn their focus back to social media. Because the plot needed things to happen quickly, characters started making decisions that I felt were really rash and honestly kind of mindless, and not necessarily because that's who they are as characters, but because like the storyline demanded it. I think that's why some of these characters are starting to come off as frustrating and self-serving this season, even though there's no real reason that they should be, other than the writers needing to push the plot forward as quickly as possible. It feels like writers of shows like The Buccaneers aren't listening to fans when they're begging for more slow burn romances because, you know, somehow that would diminish the drama. And I'm sorry, but I have got to talk about how outlandish these costumes have gotten. I'm usually very forgiving when it comes to historical accuracy, but this season, they really upped the ante in a way that became super distracting. Nan's red dress is so modern and out of place. It feels like it pulls you right out of the story, in my opinion. And it feels like some of these shows are trying to be like Victorian era Bridgertons, when what made the Buccaneers interesting in the first place was the possibility that it could be something that was more like grounded and character driven and like exploring female bonds. And rather than standing toe to toe with classic coming of age stories like Little Women, where the relationships and the inner lives are given some room to breathe, it felt like the Buccaneers opted for, you know, modern excess over emotional substance. And I don't know why they decided to go in that direction with this particular story. Some people might be wondering why I listed The Lady's Companion on my list of the best period dramas of 2025, while The Buccaneers landed in the worst, especially when The Lady's Companion is just as frothy and cheesy and historically ridiculous, if not more so. And it's not because I'm turning up my nose at campy or frothy or unserious period dramas. I very clearly enjoy them. The difference is that The Lady's Companion knows exactly what it is. It doesn't pretend to be prestige television or like a faithful historical interpretation of a classic novel. It puts all its cards out on the table and says, hey, here's some fun bit of froth. And it fully commits to that tone. The Buccaneers, on the other hand, wants to have it both ways. It asks us to take it seriously as kind of compelling television, to emotionally invest in high stakes drama, and to respect it as an adaptation of an unfinished work by a serious female classic author, and then leans into rushed romances and modernized aesthetics. And I think it's fair to feel a little frustrated when that combination ends up cheapening parts of the original story, not because it's fun or cheesy, but because it's asking for emotional and literary weight that it hasn't really earned. And I know that they could continue on this series in any way they like because it was an unfinished book, but I really just expected so much more from this series. And instead, it's become kind of a chaotic mess. I'm hoping maybe for season 3, it will take a bit of a different turn and maybe take itself more seriously. I don't know. I feel like now they've fully committed down this kind of teenage route, and I guess that's where we're going from here. But I do enjoy it. I just wish it wasn't like an adaptation of an Edith Wharton novel, if that makes sense. Next is the House of Guinness. So next is Stephen Knight's House of Guinness, which came out in September 2025 and attempted to dramatize the rise of the Guinness brewing dynasty in 19th century Ireland, and it starred Anthony Boyle and Louis Partridge. On paper, the series promised a rich exploration of family and capitalism and colonial tension in Ireland, in a time period we've not seen a lot based in Ireland. In execution, it became one of the year's most like cool, edgy, sexy series. And I'm still kind of asking myself in this day and age of a cost of living crisis and political tensions, like, why? I have already done a full deep dive on this show where I really unpacked my issues with it. So I'm not gonna rant as long about this series as I have done with other shows. Do check out that video, but I am going to explore some of the core reasons that the House of Guinness sat kind of uncomfortably with me. One of the show's most glaring problems is how the show handles working class representation. For a story that is supposed to be about Irish society and power, the working class barely exists as anything other than angry crowds or background tension. And when we do get a working class character with actual screen time, it's just like one gorgeous romantic leading lady who's largely detached from any real community. We don't see the day-to-day hardship of her life with the people around her or the systematic injustices shaping her world. Instead, her story quickly becomes about falling in love with a Guinness, and it's framed as this kind of like exciting, forbidden, aspirational romance. And that choice to me tells you a lot about where the show's sympathies lie. The show really leans into being sexy, and I mean, at times, kind of aggressively so. And it feels like the show is constantly trying to remind us that this family is really cool and they are like kind of mafia bad guy cool. That wouldn't necessarily be an issue if it were paired with deeper social context, but it's really sensual and it becomes this aesthetic layer that distracts from the historical realities the show kind of gestures to but doesn't really engage with. There are moments when the series does show some interesting things culturally. So for instance, the Irish language and popular Irish music. Sometimes these elements are culturally rich, but a lot of times they're just devices to show how cool the Guinness family is, instead of it being a more meaningful way to center Irish history. Some of the hardships for working class Irish characters are shown briefly, but it's largely swept aside in favor of sensationalism and sexy drama. The famine becomes kind of background texture to the Guinnesses' family troubles where they have to annoyingly interact with the riffraff, rather than a more foundational trauma shaping the entire society that the show claims to depict. And that's why ultimately the House of Guinness ends up on one of the worst period dramas of 2025 list for me. It's not that it is badly made or badly acted. On the contrary, I think there are some stellar performances, and like Anthony Boyle, inject him into every period drama going forward. But it is that it consistently prioritizes glamour and sex appeal and like the fashionable lifestyle of the rich as something that is exciting over all the other plot lines. Had this show have actually taken its working class character seriously and still left in the sexiness and the edginess, we might be having a different conversation. But I can't overlook the way that dynamic was handled in this series, which is why it landed in the worst rather than the best category. It is a fine, fine line when you ask your immensely talented cast to sex up a show and make it exciting for like the viralness of it all, rather than leaning into more nuanced conversations around class and exploitation. And I'm really hoping that season 2 maybe will do a better job of exploring that. It was really interesting seeing the difference between the reception of House of Guinness between Irish people and people outside of Ireland, because a lot of international audiences were like, wow, this was so cool and sexy and I love these characters and this is like the new Peaky Blinders coming out. And then a lot of Irish critics and people on social media were like, wow, this really flattens Irish people and really makes it seem like the working class are just background characters and, you know, this is just an over-the-top drama, rather than sparking meaningful discussion. I feel like House of Guinness became an example of how historical dramas can alienate the very audiences whose history they are trying to depict, which is sad when it has so much potential to show so much else, including, I'm thinking they're going to build this up in season 2, a lot of Irish characters immigrating to the US and how that affects them. So to me, this is not saying the show was bad by any means. It's saying that I think in some ways it got started off on the wrong foot. And if they just course correct a tiny bit, there are ways the show could still be really edgy and fun and also have a profound impact on people around Irish history. Next up is Agatha Christie's Towards Zero. If you are asking, what is this and when did it come out? You're not alone. It feels like sometimes they just put these murder mystery adaptations out into the wind and they're just floating out there in the ether. And I genuinely don't know how these types of series make money because I don't know who watched this. Oh, me, because it's my very, very, very part-time job to do so. So let's dive in to why it's on my 2025 period drama naughty list. So this was a BritBox/BBC 3-part adaptation with a cast that was really stellar, to be honest. Angelica Houston and Matthew Rhys. I wish they'd put him in more period dramas. I'd love to see him in a romance period drama, but I don't know if we will ever get one. Critics and a lot of viewers and myself have straight up called this boring and too slow and saying the murder mystery doesn't kick in quickly enough and that there's not enough of the clever plotting that makes Agatha Christie's work so addictive. People noticed that there were character changes and the pacing was so much different. The general plot should have been exciting. A man brings home his new wife to meet his adoptive mother, and essentially they spend their honeymoon with his ex-wife. So it should have been juicy, but it was just boring. I want to talk about Angelica Houston for a moment. She plays the formidable matriarch in this series. She is a legend, an icon. I watched Ever After not that long ago, and her performance in that ages so well. She is just incredible at playing like mean, stern characters. But she's been on hiatus for a while, and I kind of suspect that it might be for health reasons, so I do hope she's doing okay. But seeing her in this should have been a huge highlight. So I was excited to see her in an Agatha Christie adaptation because I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect for her. But for a lot of viewers and like me, it did not feel like her talents were fully utilized. In the series, she mostly is bedridden And, she plays this kind of regal, severe, dignified character, but it felt like the character was a bit flattened and one-dimensional, and it didn't give Houston much to do. And it felt like she was just severe just for the fact that she was like an older, authoritative figure rather than being a more nuanced villain that we know that she can play. A lot of the reactions were pretty brutal, saying her presence is one of the few reasons to stick with the series. And then other people felt like, it wasn't enough to elevate the lack of suspense or engagement or excitement in this series. To give Towards Zero some credit, this isn't a bad adaptation in the way that some of the darker Sarah Phelps style Christie adaptations were. Those were shockingly like grim, and it turned audiences off. In truth, Towards Zero is just forgettable. Like, there is nothing to write home about for this series. Like so many other period dramas this year, the production values were high, the period detail and cast looked okay, and every now and then there would be a moment with like Matthew Rhys I would get excited about, but nothing really stuck. Like the pacing dragged and the suspense was really muted, and the charm that made older Perot and Marple adaptations classic is just missing from so many of these newer Agatha Christie adaptations. Honestly, until adaptations figure out how to balance darkness and real suspense and Christie's signature charm and wit, these one-off miniseries are just going to keep falling flat. Too many of them fall into this trap of not being bad, just forgettable. And with a writer that is as beloved as Agatha Christie, that feels like a real shame in my mind. I feel like it is time to take a pause of Agatha Christie adaptations for a while until they figure out how to actually please some of the fans and bring out, something a bit memorable, because geez, I barely remember what the plot of this was, and I rewatched it not that long ago. I know a lot of people don't care for Kenneth Branagh's Perot, and I've got mixed feelings, but at least there is something like suspenseful and exciting about them, as in like the music and the color grading and the setting is supposed to like evoke something within you. And there is a bit of like mysterious whimsy about those adaptations. I feel like you should walk away from seeing an Agatha Christie murder mystery and feel charged a bit and on edge and connected with a bit more of like the animalistic, brutal side of society. But adaptations like this just leave me depressed in the end. And I feel like depressed is not what this type of murder mystery is supposed to make you feel. I don't know where we've gotten in society that every single murder mystery has to be as edgy and effed up as like True Detective. But I think Knives Out is proof how people want their murder mysteries to explore things like religion or darker parts of humanity, but to sprinkle in a bit of like mysterious whimsy, for heaven's sake. Netflix are making their own, I think it's their first Agatha Christie adaptation, and I was hoping that maybe it would be a bit more like warm and witty compared to series like Towards Zero, because we do not need another one of these. But I don't know, I was kind of mixed about that series. I watched it and I was like, oh, this is charming at points and exciting at others, but ultimately it feels like it's not much different from what we've seen before. So I don't know. I just think it is time to pause these Agatha Christie adaptations for a bit until they really come out with something stellar. Next up is King and Conqueror. So the last show on my worst period dramas of 2025 list is King and Conqueror, which was an 8-episode historical drama that premiered on BBC One in August 2025, and then it's been rolling out internationally on platforms like Prime Video, I think. It's basically a dramatization of one of the most famous turning points in English history, which is the events leading up to the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and the rivalry between Harold Godwinson and William, Duke of Normandy, and how that changed the course of a kingdom. Dun dun dun! On paper, this is exactly the kind of big historical story period drama fans should be excited about. It's got major stakes and real historical tension and epic battles and power plays. It gets out of the ballrooms and drawing rooms of period dramas and onto the battlefield, which should be an exciting change for period drama viewers. but instead it felt kind of like just dark and hollow and not much else. James Norton played Harold Godwinson, and Nikolaj Coster-Waldau, I think is correct, from Game of Thrones' Jaime Lannister, is William the Conqueror. So you've got some strong names in this show, but a lot of people walked away from watching this feeling like it should have been better than it was. Part of the issue was that a lot of people described the show as boring or drab, even though it was supposed to be packed with like epic drama and action. One of the biggest critiques was that the world felt gray and lifeless. Lots of dark costumes, dark interiors, muddy battlefields, and without much contrast to like the vividness of the setting at the time. I don't feel like this is aesthetic nitpicking. I feel like it makes audiences not want to go back in time. And even when things are brutal on screen, you have to have an element of people wanting to step back with you to make it interesting. If every scene feels like walking into a rainstorm, it makes it harder to feel invested in why we're there watching this in the first place. It's so weird because it feels like the sort of Regency / Victorian period dramas half the time go way overboard with colors and modern patterns and like outlandish hair and skirts, etc., to make the period dramas more exciting when they don't necessarily have to be. Whilst these more war-esque medieval period dramas want to drain the color out of the clothing when that wasn't historically accurate. And I do not know why they keep doing that. I don't know what makes them think that monotoning everything to make the battles seem more serious or dark or something will somehow make people want to keep tuning in. Historical storytelling in this time period is really, really hard to pull off as a series. There's often less documentation, which means that writers have to fill in massive gaps. But rather than using those gaps to build compelling personalities or narratives or well-developed settings or interesting costumes, King and Conqueror leans heavily on grim visuals and exposition and slow episodes full of talking heads and tactical plotting that makes audiences struggle to want to watch people just fight in the gloomy rain. This show wanted to be an epic saga, but it just felt heavy for like grim, edgy's sake. I found myself comparing it to shows like Shogun, where even though the settings are serious and violent, there's color and character and humanity woven into the world. There's also danger, obviously, but you get a sense of the fashion and food and sex and loyalty and betrayal and humor and beauty that it makes you want to step back and be with these characters. King and Conqueror, in my opinion, feels like episode after episode of darkness, where the visuals are washed out and the pacing just plods along and the character arcs are heavy and the dialogue doesn't give us enough reason to care. They just want things to be dark so you feel how serious this is. And I will be honest and say I did not finish all 8 episodes. 8 episodes was extreme compared to other more compelling miniseries that we've had where they managed to tell the whole story in like 3 or 4 episodes. The acting is good. The battles look intense and manly, like we get it. James Norton made some sort of comment about how this is a period drama meant to be in the mud, but if your setting is so grim and suffocating that there's no sense to transport us to this world and we can't really get a grasp on why people were like laughing at a feast, it becomes hard to make the audiences go back in time with you. And I feel like that there are documentaries in this same era that make the world feel more exciting than this does. King and Conqueror presents history as darkness rather than a vivid lived experience, and that makes it surprisingly forgettable for a story that should feel like one of the biggest moments in British history. Well, that is it for me, guys. I didn't include it in this list, but if I'm being completely honest, The actual worst period drama of 2025 was a Hallmark film called A Newport Christmas. It's a time travel Christmas movie that somehow managed to be like a green screen final boss. The time travel makes no sense. There is nothing remotely historical about this, just so polished. And it reminded me of those like uncanny videos where the AI historical figures from like the Titanic are being interviewed and given those modern microphones, and it kind of looks like a video game in some ways, or a bit like Stepford Wives-ish. And the way everything was just like polished and low budget at the same time, with like the costumes being too pristine and the hair being just like mine is today. It was just too much. And I don't know why Hallmark are making these types of period dramas. It has inspired me to potentially do a full video ranking Hallmark period dramas, from the genuinely heartwarming ones to absolutely unhinged disasters. So if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments, because Hallmark's period dramas have gone completely off the rails compared to like classics like Sarah Planet or The Magic of Ordinary Days. And so I feel like, I don't know, this change over the last maybe 20, 30 years should be studied about Hallmark. Well, bring on the period dramas of 2026, because I'm going to be honest with you, I wasn't overly crazy about a lot of these that came out last year, but I am ready for the smorgasbord that is coming our way. So just be ready here on the channel, because there are so many for us to talk about. Okay, bye!